Imagine the 8th of August, 1941, the Smolny Institute, the Stavka of the Supreme High Command, the resinous, thick smoke of Herzegovina floor cigarettes, a heavy, almost physically palpable silence, broken only by the quiet clatter of telegraph machines. On the fronts, a catastrophe of such magnitude is unfolding that it makes the blood of even seasoned generals run cold. The German panzer wedges of Army Group Center are tearing through the Soviet defenses near Smolensk. In the south, a giant cauldron is rapidly and mercilessly closing around Kiev. And from a podium in Berlin, Adolf Hitler confidently declares to the entire world, "The Red Army is defeated. Soviet aviation was completely destroyed in the very first days on the lands of Belarus and Ukraine. The war in the East is practically won." And at this very moment, when German citizens calmly pour themselves an evening beer and Joseph Goebbels' ministry prepares triumphant victory marches, an ear-splitting wail of air raid sirens suddenly erupts over the capital of the Third Reich. From the night darkness, at an altitude of several thousand meters, comes the heavy, steady, rolling drone of twin-engine bombers. The first heavy, high-explosive and incendiary bombs fall on the city plunged into darkness. The German radio, half asleep and in complete confusion, announces the next morning. Last night, a large group of British aircraft attempted to bomb Berlin. There are downed English planes. However, just a few hours later, London responds with light British sarcasm through the official BBC airwaves. "We are sincerely happy for our allies' success, but our aviation was not over Berlin at all last night." So whose silhouettes were these in the cold Baltic sky? Whose bombs sent Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring into uncontrollable rage? These were the Soviet pilots of Colonel Evgeny Preobrazhensky's special group, who had taken off from the tiny, miraculously held island of Saaremaa in the Baltic Sea. This operation went down in history as one of the most daring, insane, and controversial episodes of the Great Patriotic War. But behind the glossy facade of Soviet propaganda mythology and the dryness of military reports lies a cruel, bloody drama. Was this sortie a brilliant psychological triumph that broke the enemy's spirit in the war's darkest hour? Or was it a senseless criminal sacrifice of the elite of naval and long-range aviation for the sake of newspaper headlines? Let's cast aside the usual ideological clichés today, lay out on the table the maps, the orders stamped "top secret," military intelligence reports, and German combat logs to honestly and impartially understand this incredible story. To understand the atmospheric and military hell into which the country was plunging in August of '41, let's rewind the tape of time and look into the offices of the headquarters. July and August of '41 were a time when the entire pre-war military doctrine of the Soviet Union was collapsing. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies unconditionally, and starting from the 21st of July, German aviation began regular, massive raids on Moscow. Every night, hundreds of enemy He-111 and Ju-88 bombers broke through to the Kremlin, the hammer and sickle plant, Kubinka, and the most important bridges. And although the Moscow air defense system, created by General Gromykin, operated with superhuman tension and showed high effectiveness, the very psychological fact that fascist bombs were exploding in the heart of the Soviet state dealt a terrible blow to the morale of millions of citizens. Joseph Stalin demanded an asymmetrical, immediate response. He needed a strong, stunning counterblow that would instantly break German arrogance and show the whole world The Soviet Union is not just taking a hit, it is capable of reaching the enemy in its own lair. The political order sounded extremely clear. Deliver a retaliatory bomb strike on Berlin. But how to do it when the front was rapidly rolling eastward, and the Soviet airfields near Minsk, Smolensk, Kaunas, and Vilnius had long been burning under the treads of German tank divisions? The regular army aviation was physically incapable of reaching German territory. The range of Soviet fighters and the short-range frontline PE-2 and SB bombers was insufficient even for a third of the required distance. And here, onto the historical stage, steps a man whose name long remained in the shadow of the Grand Marshal's memoirs, the commander of the USSR Naval Aviation, Lieutenant General Semyon Zhavoronkov. It was Zhavoronkov who, after a thoughtful study of the map of the Baltic Sea basin, drew attention to a unique strategic and geographical anomaly of the summer of 1941. The Moonsund archipelago, specifically the island of Ösel, known to us as Saaremaa, was still held by Soviet coastal units and Marines. The advancing Wehrmacht, rushing towards Leningrad through Pskov and Luga, had simply bypassed these islands by land, leaving them deep in its flank rear. If you look carefully at the map, the distance from the Kagel airfield on the island of Ösel to Berlin in a straight line across the Baltic Sea was about 900 kilometers. The total combat route, there and back, was almost 2,700 kilometers. For most Soviet aircraft of that time, this was an absolutely unattainable figure. However, the naval aviation of the Baltic Fleet had long-range torpedo bombers and bombers, the DB-3 and DB-3F, developed by Sergei Ilyushin's design bureau. Zhavoronkov personally went to the Kremlin to see Stalin with a daring and extremely risky plan. The People's Commissariat of Defense and the Supreme Commander himself initially regarded the idea with great skepticism, but the political effect outweighed all concerns. Let's ponder these technical parameters and figures because within them lies all the drama and incredible risk of the upcoming enterprise. The DB-3F aircraft was an excellent machine for its time, but its standard tactical range with a normal combat load was about 2,000 kilometers, and the round trip to Berlin required 2,700. This meant only one thing. The planes had to fly at the very limit of their physical capabilities, with a crushing overload and with the absolute minimum possible fuel reserve for emergencies. To overcome this curse of distance, Soviet engineers and aviation technicians took extreme, sometimes unprecedented measures. They removed from the aircraft absolutely everything that could be taken off without compromising controllability. They removed part of the heavy armor from the seats, lightened the radio equipment, and stripped ammunition for non-critical machine guns. They filled the fuselage and wing tanks with B-70 aviation gasoline to the absolute brim, literally to the last gram. The takeoff weight of the aircraft increased from the normal 7 tons to almost 10. Instead of the standard combat load of 1.5 tons, the planes could only take 500, maximum 700 kilograms of bomb load. This was usually one heavy, high-explosive bomb, Fab 500, or a combination of a Fab 250 and small incendiary bombs, ZAB 100. The entire operation hung by the thinnest of threads. Any navigational error, any unplanned deviation from the course due to strong headwinds or an attempt to fly around a storm front meant inevitable death. The fuel would be exhausted to the last drop, and the plane would simply plunge into the icy abyss of the Baltic. Yet even that was only half the problem. Let's look at Kagul airfield itself on the island of Ösel, from which these overloaded aircraft were supposed to take off. In official operational reports, it was grandly and proudly called an airfield. But in reality, it was a narrow, unpaved field completely covered in potholes, tall grass, bumps, and small shrubs. The runway length was only about 1,300 meters. For an overloaded DB-3F, this was catastrophically short. According to all manuals of the time, taking off from such a runway with such a weight was considered direct suicide. The aircraft took off literally by the skin of their teeth, bouncing over the bumps, the landing gear struts operating at the very limit of the metal's strength. Every second of the takeoff run turned into a desperate struggle with death. If the left or right M88 engines so much as coughed for an instant, or if a wheel hit a hidden hole, the bomber, overloaded with bombs and fuel, would instantly turn into a giant fireball right at the end of the runway. To somehow extend the takeoff distance, Soviet sappers, aviation technicians, and local civilians, under continuous raids by German aircraft, manually cut down the surrounding woodland, uprooted stumps, and leveled the ground with shovels. The technicians slept 2 or 3 hours a day on bare boards in earthen shelters, eating dry rations and salted fish, but they prepared the aircraft with incredible fanatical persistence. The flight route itself was a masterpiece of navigational art and, at the same time, pure madness. According to the developed plan, the aircraft were to take off in the deep Baltic twilight, fly over the sea at an extremely low altitude, just tens of meters above the water, to avoid detection by German shipborne radars and coastal observation posts. Then, approaching the German coast near Stettin, the bombers were to make a prolonged climb to an altitude of 7,000 meters. Let's consider what 7,000 meters meant in August 1941 for the crew of a DB-3F. The aircraft's cabins were completely unpressurized. The outside temperature at that altitude dropped to -35, sometimes even 40 degrees. The cockpit canopy glass would instantly become covered with a thick layer of ice and frost, which the pilots and navigators had to scrape off with ordinary Finnish knives. The oxygen equipment was imperfect and primitive. Oxygen masks would freeze solid from human breath, causing dangerous hypoxia, oxygen deprivation that clouds consciousness. The pilots experienced hellish pain in their joints. Their fingers and toes went numb from severe frostbite. And in this semi-conscious state, at the limit of human endurance, they had to control the heavy aircraft in absolute darkness, without visual references, maintaining strict radio silence to avoid detection by German direction finders. And so, the night of August 7th to 8th, 1941, arrived. The first flagship sortie. A group of 15 aircraft, commanded by Colonel Evgeny Preobrazhensky, commander of the 1st Mine Torpedo Aviation Regiment of the Baltic Fleet, took to the air. Consider the situation in the German skies that night. The German air defense system for Berlin was considered one of the strongest in the world. Hundreds of large-caliber anti-aircraft guns, powerful searchlights, Freya and Würzburg radar stations, and Luftwaffe night fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf-110. But that first night, the Soviet pilots had one decisive advantage: absolute surprise, and the complete blindness of the German command due to their own arrogance. The Nazi air defense simply did not believe that Soviet aircraft could appear in the skies over the capital of the Reich. When Preobrazhensky's group reached Berlin, the German anti-aircraft gunners greeted them with signal flares, querying with light codes. "Who are you? What is your unit? Have you lost your way?" The German operators thought a large group of their own bombers was flying overhead, returning from a mission or lost in the night sectors. The Soviet pilots did not engage in radio communication. Preobrazhensky's flagship aircraft reached the target, the central districts of Berlin, military-industrial sites, and a major railway junction. Navigator Captain Koklov gave the command, and the bomb bay doors opened. Descending to 5,000 meters, the Soviet ships dropped the first bombs. Deafening explosions shook the night streets of Berlin. Bright fires instantly flared up below. Wild panic erupted in the sky. The Reich's anti-aircraft batteries finally realized what was happening and opened chaotic, disorderly fire. But the Soviet planes, having completed their combat mission, were already turning back onto their return course. Again, hundreds of kilometers over the sea in complete darkness, the fuel gauges fell to zero. Several aircraft landed at the Kagul airfield with their engines already completely dead, literally gliding onto the dry runway in the last meters of altitude. But the fact remains, on the 8th of August 1941, all 15 aircraft of Preobrazhensky's group returned to base without a single loss. It was a triumph, a real shock for the Nazi high command. The world's reaction to this raid was like the explosion of the most powerful bomb. The newspaper Pravda and the Soviet Information Bureau blared victorious releases the next day. For the Soviet people, enduring the terrible days of retreat, the loss of ancient cities, and the death of their sons and brothers, this news became a powerful breath of hope. People in factories, in evacuation, and in trenches repeated to each other, "Our boys are bombing Berlin! Do you hear? Berlin!" In London and Washington, leading newspapers came out with giant headlines. U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill received real, irrefutable confirmation that the Soviet Union did not intend to surrender, that its war machine was alive and capable of delivering precise, crushing blows to the very heart of the enemy. Politically, it was an absolute Grand Master checkmate to Joseph Goebbels, who just a day earlier had sworn from the rostrum that the Soviet Air Force no longer existed. But it is here that we approach the most difficult, grim, and contentious stage of our history. If the first raid went perfectly due to the element of surprise, then what began afterward? What began afterward was the harsh, bloody routine of war, in which the supreme political leadership of the USSR, headed by Stalin, demanded from the military not just a continuation, but a colossal increase in the scale of the raids. Berlin must be bombed regularly and with maximum force. Such was the categorical demand of the Kremlin. But was it possible to increase these strikes under those real conditions without catastrophic losses? And here, military expediency collided with a harsh political will, leading to tragedies that were preferred to be kept silent about in Soviet times. The German command recovered instantly. An enraged Adolf Hitler signed Directive No. 33A and then special operational orders demanding that the Soviet bases on the Moonsund Islands be wiped off the face of the earth immediately, at any cost. Huge forces of the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine were thrown into the Baltic. A real hunt began around the island of Ösel. German submarines and torpedo boats blockaded the supply of fuel and ammunition. German air defense around Berlin and along the coast of Pomerania was strengthened many times over. New radar stations appeared, dozens of fresh anti-aircraft batteries, and the best night fighters took to the skies. It was now impossible to go unnoticed a second, third, or fourth time. Every appearance of Soviet aircraft was met with a dense, fiery wall of tracer shells and the powerful beams of searchlights crisscrossing the sky, singling out the lone Soviet bombers and turning them into easy targets. And here arises a question that Soviet historians long kept silent. What was the real price of these continuing raids? Starting from the second raid, heavy losses began. And not just losses, but the death of the best of the best. After all, the 1st Mine Torpedo Air Regiment of the Baltic Fleet consisted of ace pilots, navigators, and mechanics, trained by years of pre-war service. This was the elite, the unique capital of the Navy, people who knew how to conduct blind navigation over the sea and attack enemy battleships and cruisers with torpedoes. And now these unique specialists were being sent in old, overloaded planes through the defended skies of Europe to bomb targets, the effect of which, from a purely military point of view, was minimal. After all, 500 kilograms of bombs, dropped by a single plane from a great height in the darkness, could not destroy a large factory or cripple the infrastructure of a multi-million metropolis. These were pinpricks to the body of a giant, but to Stalin, this seemed insufficient. Realizing that the Baltic airmen were becoming exhausted and their resources on the island of Özel were dwindling before his eyes, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief decided to involve the long-range bomber aviation under the command of Brigade Commander Mikhail Vodopyanov, a famous polar pilot and hero of the Soviet Union, in the operation. And here unfolded one of the most terrible and inept tragedies of the initial period of the war. Vodopyanov was ordered to strike Berlin from the Pushkin airfield near Leningrad, using the newest, barely commissioned heavy 4-engine PE-8s, then called TB-7s, with M40 and M30 diesel engines, as well as twin-engine ER-2s. The idea seemed beautiful on paper. The giant PE-8s could carry up to 4 tons of bombs, including the devastating FAB-2000. But in practice, it turned into a real nightmare. Let's take an honest look at the documents from that night, from the 11th to the 12th of August, 1941. The M40 diesel engines by Atyasov were absolutely unfinished, raw, and capricious. They stalled in the air for no apparent reason, choked at high altitude. The crews had not had time to master the new, extremely complex technology. The takeoff of Vodopyanov's division from Pushkin resembled a live broadcast of a catastrophe. Out of 14 selected PE-8 and ER-2 aircraft, only an insignificant fraction managed to break through to Berlin. One PE-8 crashed immediately after takeoff due to engine failure, burying its crew. A second was mistakenly shot down by its own Soviet anti-aircraft artillery immediately after crossing the front line. The Air Defense Service simply did not know of the existence of such gigantic Soviet aircraft and mistook it for a German Focke-Wulf or Junkers. A third aircraft, commanded by Vodopyanov himself, reached Berlin, dropped its bombs, but on the return journey, 2 of its engines failed. The plane made a forced landing in the forests of Estonia, in territory already occupied by the enemy. Only by a miracle did Vodopyanov's crew manage to make their way back to their own lines. From that night attack of Vodopyanov's group, almost half of the aircraft did not return or crashed. It was a crushing failure. Vodopyanov was immediately removed from his position as division commander, although, in the chaos and haste, his fault was minimal. People were driven into battle with faulty, unfinished equipment to fulfill a rigid political order. Look at this contrast. On one hand, the filigree navigation and cold calculation of Preobrazhensky's Baltic airmen. On the other, the rush, chaos, and tragic death of the long-range aviation crews due to unprepared equipment and a lack of coordination. But even after this catastrophe, the raids did not stop. Until the beginning of September 1941, The naval pilots from the island of Ösel and the remnants of the long-range aviation made a total of 10 massive sorties against Berlin and other German cities, such as Stettin, Danzig, and Königsberg. Let us turn to the dry statistics and figures contained in the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense and the Archives of the Navy. In total, from August 8th to September 5th, 1941, Soviet pilots made 86 sorties to Berlin. 33 aircraft broke through to the target and delivered their bombs. Approximately 36 tons of bombs, as well as thousands of propaganda leaflets, were dropped on the capital of the Third Reich. As a result of combat losses, takeoff and landing accidents, and technical failures, 18 Soviet aircraft were lost, and 77 experienced aviators, the cream of Soviet military aviation, were killed or went missing. In September of '41, German troops closed in on the Moonsund Islands. The Kagul airfield was subjected to continuous artillery fire. The stocks of aviation fuel were depleted, and the runway was plowed up by craters. On the 5th of September, the final order was given to evacuate the remaining aircraft and personnel to the mainland. The epic of the 1941 Berlin raids was over. To fully appreciate the courage of the navigators and pilots on those night flights, one must imagine in detail how dead reckoning and orientation over the dark expanse of the Baltic were conducted. In '41, the Soviet naval bombers DB-3F had neither modern radio compasses nor onboard radars nor electronic maps. All navigation was carried out solely by compass, stopwatch, and visual landmarks. But what visual landmarks can there be in the night darkness over an endless sea covered in fog? The only means of checking wind drift were luminous aviation bombs and marker sea flares dropped on the water. Navigator Captain Koklov and his colleagues calculated the drift angle from the flashes on the water, making adjustments for the stormy Baltic wind. Had the wind changed direction by just 5 to 7 degrees, and the navigator failed to notice it in the darkness, the aircraft would have missed Berlin by tens of kilometers, or would have slipped through the narrow corridor between the air defense zones and flown straight into the fire of the coastal batteries of Danzig or Stettin. Such navigational precision under conditions of complete radio silence is the highest level of professionalism which is still studied in military academies. A particularly dramatic chapter of this operation was the daily life and supply of the island of Saaremaa during the days of the raids. The Kagul airfield was a tiny patch of land surrounded by swamps and farmsteads. The logistics of supply were almost completely destroyed. Fuel for the bombers, high-octane aviation gasoline B-70, was delivered to the island under fire from German aircraft by small boats and old barges from Leningrad and Tallinn. Loading and unloading were done manually. Barrels were carried by hand, waist-deep in icy water. Munitions, heavy FAB 500 and FAB 250 bombs, were manually hoisted under the aircraft fuselages using primitive winches and the muscle power of the technicians. Often, refueling and bomb loading had to be done directly during enemy raids, when German reconnaissance planes and Junkers Ju-88 bombers circled over the airfield, dropping fragmentation bombs and strafing with machine guns. Every barrel of gasoline on Saaremaa was washed in the blood of Soviet sailors and technicians. No less interesting and lesser known is the fact of how the German leadership tried to hide the truth about the first Soviet air raids from its own population. In the first days after the 8th of August, German newspapers like the Völkischer Beobachter and radio stations broadcast strict warnings that Berliners should be wary of British air pirates. However, when fragments with Cyrillic markings and remnants of Soviet leaflets printed in German were found at the bomb impact sites, real hysteria broke out in the Berlin headquarters. Goebbels personally banned any mention of the Cyrillic inscriptions, and the SD security police received a strict order to confiscate all Soviet leaflets from the population, under threat of immediate dispatch to a concentration camp. The Nazi regime was panic-stricken that the German man in the street would understand the main point. Göring's promises that not a single enemy bomb would fall on Berlin had turned out to be complete lies, and the war in the East was far from over. And now, when the entire panorama of these events is unfolded before us, from the first enthusiastic reports to the tragic loss reports, the main historical and moral question looms large before us. Was it worth it? How should we assess these raids from today's perspective? If we look at this problem, we see a clash of three fundamentally different concepts and historiographical schools, each of which puts forward its own, very convincing arguments. The first point of view is the traditional, official Soviet historiography, which later passed into many modern Russian military historical works. According to this version, the raids on Berlin in August 1941 were not just a military operation, but a greatest strategic and moral psychological feat. At a time when Goebbels's propaganda was convincing the whole world of the complete destruction of the Red Army, Soviet bombs over Berlin shattered this myth to its foundations. It was a colossal psychological blow to the leadership of the Third Reich and to the German population, which for the first time realized that war was not just victory marches in foreign countries, but also death falling from the sky onto their own homes. Moreover, these raids had enormous international significance. They strengthened the confidence of the Allies, Great Britain and the USA, in the USSR's combat capability, accelerated decisions on Lend-Lease supplies, and forced Hitler to keep a large group of fighter aircraft and air defense deep within Germany, diverting them from the front. The second point of view is the perspective of the German side, recorded in the memoirs of Luftwaffe generals, Joseph Goebbels's diaries, and documents of the Wehrmacht High Command. German historiography tends to assess the military results of these raids condescendingly and even dismissively. German researchers point out that the 36 tons of bombs dropped on the giant metropolis over a month did not cause any tangible damage to Germany's military industry. The destruction was minimal. A few residential buildings were damaged, a couple of factory workshops on the outskirts were hit, and several dozen civilians were killed. From a military point of view, these damages were negligible compared to the damage inflicted later by the massive raids of the British Air Force. The German leadership viewed these raids as an annoying but minor nuisance, and the main conclusion drawn by the Luftwaffe was the necessity of quickly eliminating the Soviet bases in the Baltics, which was accomplished by September. And finally, the third point of view is the position of independent modern researchers and critics of Soviet military leadership. This concept is harsh and uncompromising. Critics argue that Operation Berlin was a typical headline-grabbing action, a purely propaganda show organized by Stalin for demonstrative effect. The price of this show turned out to be monstrously disproportionate to the results obtained. At a critical moment in the war, when Soviet troops on the Leningrad front and near Smolensk were catastrophically short of air support, when every bomber and every experienced crew was worth its weight in gold, precious DB-3F and PE-8 aircraft burned tons of the rarest high-octane gasoline and perished in the Baltic waters, just to drop single bombs on Berlin. The loss of 77 elite Baltic pilots and dozens of unique machines weakened the naval aviation of the Baltic Fleet for years to come. As a result, when the Germans were closing the blockade ring around Leningrad, Soviet aviation was unable to offer proper resistance, precisely because its best forces had been exhausted in the Berlin adventures. Let's pause for a minute and try to weigh each of these arguments. Can we call the death of the pilots meaningless when we know what a colossal spiritual uplift these reports caused among the soldiers in the trenches near Kiev, Vyazma, and Smolensk? In the conditions of 1941, when the army was retreating and the country was on the brink of disaster, the factor of morale often weighed more than 100 destroyed enemy tanks. The man in the trench needed to know that his country was not broken, that it was striking the enemy in his capital. This gave him the strength to stand his ground to the death. On the other hand, did the country's leadership have the right to send raw, unfinished equipment and untrained crews to certain death, as happened with Vodopyanov's division, for the sake of a quick political report? Let's imagine an alternative scenario. What would have happened if these forces, Preobrazhensky's regiment and Vodopyanov's division, had been thrown in their entirety not at Berlin, but at striking the advancing German tank columns of Guderian and Hoth, at the crossings over the Dnieper and the western Dwina? Could this have changed the course of the Battle of Smolensk, or delayed the fall of Kiev? Possibly. But on the other hand, without these audacious strikes on Berlin, perhaps the Allies in London and Washington would have had serious doubts about whether Moscow would hold out until winter, which could have delayed the crucial negotiations on aid. The history of the Soviet air raids on Berlin in August of 1941 is not a black-and-white picture from a textbook. It is an immensely complex, contradictory knot, where the insane heroism of ordinary pilots, the filigree skill of navigators, the incompetence and haste of the high command, cruel political expediency, and the great tragedy of the people are all woven into one whole. Every one of those pilots who took off from the muddy runway of Kagul airfield into the dark Baltic night understood perfectly well his chance of returning was less than 50%. They flew not for awards and not for Stalin's prizes. They flew because behind them was a collapsing but undefeated country. And so now, when all the cards, all the documents, figures, and arguments of the opposing sides have been laid out before you, I want to address you directly, my viewer. Look at this story through the prism of the past. Weigh all the pros and cons. What are these August raids of 1941 to you? Were they the greatest psychological and political triumph, showing the whole world the unyielding will of the people and turning the mental tide of the war, even at the cost of cruel losses? Or do you see in this a cruel, senseless adventure by the leadership, which threw the flower of Soviet aviation into the furnace of propaganda with their lives for the sake of fleeting newspaper headlines? Which of these versions seems to you the most convincing, honest, and historically just? Think about it, compare the facts, and draw your own conclusion.